All right, so this these presentations are going to be about the heart specifically and looking at what the heart does for us. Functionally, we have to have enough blood pressure to push the blood we just got through talking about. We have to direct that blood, and therefore the heart is going to be divided into two basic circuits, pulmonary and systemic. All right, and we control the amount, so and keep that blood moving in one direction. And when we use the term flow, of course, we're talking about rate, how fast and how much is moving at that time. So flow is a very important metric for us when we talk about the heart. But the heart is really a muscular pump. Cardiac muscle is very similar to skeletal muscle, so don't forget that as you're trying to think about how this muscle functions. All right? I just want to, you're not going to have to know this, but you've got to distribute blood to the entire body, right? Because all these cells are in need of oxygen, and they have to get rid of their carbon dioxide, and they need those hormones, and they need the nutrients. So I just give you this wow factors, right? This muscle is going to contract this many times in a day, and this much through this, and this is the one thing that's probably going to be relatively constant. This is going to be altered depending on your need. Okay, so you can actually, obviously, can contract more or less, and the amount of blood you send is really going to be dependent upon your need. But do recall that you only have 5 to 6 liters in total, and you're not getting really more of that, and hopefully never experience less of that. But it's just the ability to send it over and over again. All right. So heart anatomy, we're really doing in lab. So I say, this is really key to its ability to do what it does, and this including starting with, a slight moving 2/3 to the left of the midline, held in the mediastinum of the body, in its own pericardial sac, and the apex where the contraction is going to start, pushing the blood out through the base. So positioned very well for the job it's going to do. All right. So the chambers we look at, there are 4 chambers, okay, and there's 2 basic circuits. So the circuits are completely divided into by these very thick septums between the ventricles and a little bit thinner between the atria. So intraatrial and intraventricular septums keep the right side and left side separate. And then there are 4 chambers, 2 on the top called the atria and 2 in the inferior position called the ventricles, all right? And so just the basic dynamics of the heart. So we say the superior 2 are the atria, and they receive blood. They receive blood either from the body, when you're here looking at the right side, so they're receiving systemic blood through the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinuses, or they're receiving from the lungs. And so here, with the blood coming back from the lungs, you see that it's red in color here, which shows that it's been oxygenated. But as I just said, it's veins that bring blood to the heart and arteries that take it away. So the coloration is not necessarily an indicator that you have an artery or a vein. All right. The inferior 2 chambers are the ventricles, and they really are the pumpers. The right side of the heart is the most anterior, when you're looking at the front of the heart, as you did in that last, the picture on the first page. And then the left ventricle is really the entire apex, as it shows you here, and is more of the inferior posterior. So much of the back side of the heart is where you see the left ventricle. All right, divided, as I said already, by these septums, and then the atria from the ventricles by valves, which we collectively call the AV, or atrioventricular valves. And we're going to learn these as the tricuspid on the right and the bicuspid on the left, and that's also called the mitral valve. All right. So here's a cartoon of the circuits, right? So pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit. The movement of blood is really one of the most important things is for oxygenation, right? And then delivery of oxygen. So that's why I say here, big oxygen is the key, right? We color code blood that has received oxygen as red, and that has given up some of its oxygen as blue, though it really is just a darker red, not blue. So the pulmonary circuit is what the right side of the heart is really focused on. And it's because the right side of the heart, after it enters the ventricle, it's pushed to the lungs, as you see it here going through the pulmonary artery, also called a trunk because it's short, separating into a right and left pulmonary circuit, right? So each lung is delivered deoxygenated blood that then becomes oxygenated. And this force of contraction in the right ventricle will send it here, and it will give it enough energy to get back, as you're seeing it come here, back to the left atrium. So back to the heart, the left side this time. The left side is therefore known as the systemic circuit, and it takes this freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs and pushes it out to the body. So it would come down here into the ventricle and then out. Right? So here we see it going out to the body. And here's a branch coming up to go up to the head. So, and we're going to talk about those branches in another chapter, but that's the idea. All right. So I tell students, look, you've really got to learn to just trace the blood flow and try to understand. So, you know, again, you better understand the function of the heart and name the parts as you go through it. That's a really good exercise in lab. Again, leaving the right side of the heart, right, after it's come back from the body, and I kind of color this darker blue for this deoxygenated, right? So back through inferior, superior vena cava, coronary sinus back here, into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, down to the right ventricle, and out, right, through the pulmonary artery that then splits. All right? This trunk goes to the right and left artery, which becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, become pulmonary capillaries out over here and over here, where gas exchange happens, which we'll talk about in the respiratory chapter. But yeah, we have to get all the way down to the pulmonary capillaries that will be right next to the alveoli to get adequate gas exchange. And that's the only place we're going to get oxygen, and the only place we're going to give up carbon dioxide. All right? And then we return to the left side, right? So we come back through the pulmonary veins. Here's a left pulmonary vein, right pulmonary veins, right, into this left atrium. And, you know, again, it says vessels get bigger and bigger until they become the left and right pulmonary veins to the left atrium, go down to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta and off to the body, as we'll see later on. All right? Leaving the left side, I said, again, you're going to have the aorta branch. Here's our aorta branch, and vessels get smaller and smaller and become the systemic capillaries. And this is where we're going to get the exchange, right, between the blood with its gas and oxygen specifically, and the cells of the body. All right? And capillaries, again, returns back to the right side again, right? So we kind of follow that circuit through, returns to the right side. Capillaries become veins, and those veins then end in the right atrium. So a nice, complete, right, circuit, closed circulatory system. Blood is never leaving these tubes. The tubes change in their appearance, the thickness of the wall, and the diameter of the tubes, but blood is going to stay in them. All right? The membranes here to protect this heart, we have, it's collectively called the pericardium. It has an actually outer fibrous layer, which I liken to the dura mater for students, because it really is very much like that, a very tough, dense connective tissue, which is surrounding and containing the heart, confining it, and also preventing it from overfilling, which can be a problem, because again, the heart's got to get into a rhythm. It has to fill and move, fill and move, fill and move, right? So we have the two, you know, the fibrous pericardium, and then we have a serous pericardium, and that's going to be two layers, because all serous membranes are. And so you will have a parietal layer, as they kind of show you in the letter pink here, which is pretty close, pretty much attached to the fibrous. There's a little layer of fluid in the pericardial cavity. It's not really as big as this, but it's like a very, very thin amount, again, to help with lubrication and reducing friction, you know, in a moving part and an always moving part. And then we'd have a visceral layer, which is continuous with the first layer of the heart, called the epicardium. So again, this really is similar in that nature to what you saw in the meninges surrounding the brain. All right, so we also have then in the wall, right, so here's our epicardium, continuous with the visceral pericardium. In the wall, the majority of this is the myocardium, so muscle part. And that's the job of the heart, so that makes sense. And then again, on the innermost chambers, right, contacting the blood, is the endocardium, which is going to be very, very smooth connective tissue to minimize any sort of problem with blood, like clotting, which could occur if we did not have a smooth layer. All right, so here this really looks at the walls of the heart, like I just told you guys, right? capillaries and nerves in that epicardium, epi on top of, myo is the majority, and then the endocardium is again this epithelial, very thin connective tissue. It's continuous also with the endothelium of the vessel, so the innermost lining. All of the heart and the vessels is extremely smooth, and mostly what again we call endothelial. It's a special type of epithelial cells. This shows the patterns here of the muscle. Heart tissue is a nightmare to cut. When I used to cut that for a living, man, to get the fibers running in the same direction, or really it's the fascicles that you see, and then the fibers if we were down to the cell level. All right, but it's crazy because it goes in all these different whorls, if you will. Now, what this means is, of course, these are made of sarcomeres, and we're not going to go back into that, but as sarcomeres, you know, from the chapter on skeletal muscle, that they shorten, right, and bring these Z lines very closer together as actin and myosin overlap more and more and more. And so as these, right, shorten, what really happens because of all these different directions is that the heart rings itself as opposed to just the classic contraction of something like the biceps brachii. So it's a pretty cool situation if you think about it. All right, so comparing and contrasting ventricles, this is really nice. Relaxed versus contracted, lovely cartoon. All right, the chambers are shown here, the ventricular chambers, and the wall is really what you want to pay attention to. So the right chamber is quite a bit thinner than the left. The right ventricle much thinner than the left ventricle. All right. Well, the right ventricle does not work nearly as hard. So again, like all muscle, right, the more you work or use that muscle, the bigger it will become. And so the left ventricle, the systemic, right, pushing it out to the body, has to generate about 5 times more pressure, and therefore overcome 5 times more resistance in order to push blood out and around the entire body. So over time, that left ventricle just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, while the right ventricle tends to stay fairly thin and small. Now, don't let this fool you. Both sides of the heart move the same amount of blood. All right, they just don't have to move it with as much effort because the right side just has to get it right to the lungs. Right, the left side has to get it out to the body and back. All right. So some of the surface features when you look at the front and the back of the heart. The auricles are actually these leaf-like extensions, and that was really shown on the, right, it's a piece of the actual chamber, the atrium. So it's a feature, again, an auricle is. So it's kind of these folds, they look like dog's ears, that's where you get the name auricle, all right? The sulci, which is the plural of a sulcus, is a fat-filled groove. Typically, the coronary vessels are in those, so you can't see the groove itself unless you peel the vessels off, right? And then the coronary vessels, which there should be lots of them on the surface of the heart, are delivering blood to that myocardium, right? Feed the myocardium, and they are landmarks for the chambers. So this anterior interventricular coronary artery is basically separating the left side, which we said is all apex, from the right, okay? And the circumflex over here, is separating the atria from the ventricles. And then the right coronary comes around and becomes the marginal, right, over here on the side. So, and then in the posterior view, there's a posterior interventricular artery. So they are very good landmarks for helping us understand even some of the internal features. So, and these are really just brilliant cartoons to look at. All right, the internal structures are again, the two sides are completely separate. So you have two circuits, pulmonary on the right, systemic on the left. And again, separated by these very thick interventricular septum. All right. In the atrial, which you often can't see because of the major vessels that we try to represent on these cartoons, the intraatrial has a little divot called the fossa ovalis, and we're going to talk about that later on in development, and that's where you had an opening between the two atria before you were born. Interventricular is very thick to withstand the pressure. Again, you do not want blood from the right side mixing with the blood on the left side directly. All right. And then the atrioventricular, right, so between the atria and the ventricles, 4 openings controlled by valves. So you've got this opening here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you've got the 2 here, and then you'll have 2 more openings between ventricles and vessels, all right? And that's what's spelled out here. So 2 valves between atria and ventricles, the atrioventricular valves, and 2 valves between the ventricles and vessels, collectively called the semilunar valves. And we'll pick the rest of this up on another video.